So when last we so when last we left our heroes, they just encountered their very first boss fight. Now I wanted to pause and actually go into this just a little bit more than I did last time. First of all, as any of you who've been watching these with regularity knows, I tend to ascribe to a very different viewpoint on combat when it comes to D&D as a GM. This is something I do in general, but this is something I've really gotten big on in my more recent years. Basically, if you're encountering anything other than a boss, it's trash. Literal trash, actually, in some cases. Like, for example, I use a variant, or maybe it actually is the minion system, I'm not 100% sure, because I've never actually GM'd 4th edition, from 4th edition, where in this fight, for example, there were 8 centaurs in addition to the boss. Now, every single one of those centaurs had exactly 1 hit die. No more, no less. In some cases, trash in such a similar manner will have 1 hit point. So the only purpose in ever doing trash, in my case, is for either A, if there's some lore or story reason, or B, for flavor. Like, for example, if you enter a facility that should be guarded, those soldiers will probably be minions and, you know, have 1 HP or 8 HP or whatever. But they should be there. The facility shouldn't be abandoned, right? At least under most circumstances. So they still will be there. But the only fight that actually matters is the boss fight. Now, I don't do boss fights like typical D&D either. I don't just set up a NPC or a creature and affix magical items to it or anything like that. No, 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 no. I do what I call the Zelda boss fight thing. I've mentioned this as well, but the general concept here is that there are basically no rules other than the lore. The only thing that limits me in designing a boss is what that creature or that individual should be capable of. You follow me? Oh, excuse me. So, they're fighting, there's one other mechanic that I use extensively, more for a role-playing and lore purpose than for a mechanic purpose, believe it or not. I call it the enrage mechanic. It's the point at which a creature or a person has been pushed basically past the point of reason, past the point where they're holding back at all, and they'll start to do things differently. Usually those things will also be self-detrimental, but they will, without question, be much, much harder on the party. I mention that because the very first attack that was done against this particular boss, the Centaur Lord, was a disabling strike by Araguna on his hand. It put an arrow right through his hand and disarmed him, and that triggered his enrage. Now, consequently, there are no hard and fast rules on what triggers an enrage. Obviously, going into a fight, I'll have some ideas as what will or won't based on the individual, their personality, etc., etc. But in this case, that triggered his enrage literally right at the beginning of the fight. So this was an interesting fight. He was an interesting encounter, and among the other things he did, one of the things I really wanted to share that amused me. At one point in time, Tabrin, who is a yellow mage, was prone on the grass, just kind of laying there, and for various reasons never was able to actually get up for the rest of the fight. He was just laying there the rest of the fight. The Centaur Lord had grabbed Higade, one of the humans, and literally turned and tried to fling him into the ravine to plummet to his death. Now, originally I was going to have him do some rolls to catch himself, but Tabrin was like, well, wait a minute, can I cast Float on him as like a desperation maneuver? And the idea amused me so much that I went ahead and let him. So, Tabrin is lying here on the floor and sees Higade go flying through the air, and he's like, oh my god, Float! And he hits Higade, who then, you know, comes back down to ground level and is now floating there. Now, of course, Float level 1 only lasts 6 seconds, so Higade, you know, was like, oh god, had to get out of the way. But nevertheless, I thought that was rather amusing, and I felt like sharing that. One of the things I don't like admitting to is flubbing. Let me explain this briefly. For those of you who don't understand what it means, flubbing is when the GM either changes the outcome of a dice or completely ignores the outcome of a dice. Basically, when a GM just says, this is what happens, for whatever reason. Now, as you might imagine, in the D&D community, flubbing is actually somewhat unpopular. That is because most of the time, in most GMs, statistically speaking, what you're going to find is someone who's going to flub against you, the player, usually in an unfair manner because, you know, the GM's pissed off at you, or he didn't think you should be able to do this sort of thing, or maybe he's literally just failing at, you know, GMing. Because he, you know, for example, didn't want you to go to location A, so he set up an obstacle to go into location A, but then you managed to get by that obstacle, and so he flubs it so you fail at getting by that obstacle. And now you can't go to location A, because he never planned out location A. He has no idea what's there. I don't like to flub. I really don't like to flub. In general, I consider flubbing a mark of failure on my part. So I'm only admitting this one flub to you because I admitted it to the party as well. Coulson, who was a character and a player I liked, technically should have died in this fight. And I don't mean technically as in technically, no, I mean as in by the rules, as I laid them down, he should have died. He was already in down status, and he took a rather severe hit that was actually more than... It should have killed him, is what I'm getting across here. And I decided to flub that and say, no, he didn't die. He's just still in downed. So, I admit that to you freely. I didn't want him to die. I didn't want a death in my very first adventure, and I was really feeling good about the boss fight because the players just barely beat him, and it's always a good sign, in my opinion, of a good boss fight, is when you just barely beat them, so whatever. Now, as we discussed last time, our Centaur Lord friend turned into basically a statue of earth, clay, and rock, and that crumbled into just a pile of rocks and clay and earth on the ground. Higade decided to come over. They investigated him for some time, but finally Higade decided to go ahead and touch one of them, and immediately passed out. Failed his will save, but it was a gradient save, not a pass-fail save. So in other words, he didn't fail it completely, and he just passed out. Now here's an actually interesting thing. The party assumed... I'm telling you this because I think the party forgot about this, and I just kind of feel like sharing it. The party assumed for a long time, because they never actually followed up on this, that these things were... affected someone of a particular elemental affinity, and Higade happened to be of Earth, so, you know, like, okay, anybody of Earth, do not touch these things. It actually had to do with the fact that he was human. I'll just let that thought sit there for anybody who cares to theorycraft about it. In any case, after dealing with, you know, the dead, which is funny, I'm sorry, I gotta add, one of the things that I simultaneously love and hate about this group is they take 700 billion years to decide on anything. It's awesome because it's great to see such diverse opinion amongst the group, but it's irritating sometimes, I'll admit. Nowadays I find it more awesome than irritating, but, you know, whatever, what are you gonna do? But so, I bring this up because they stood there for, I don't even know how long, trying to decide what to do about the bodies of the centaurs they just killed. Oh, speaking of which, during the battle, I need to give credit to both Rory and Whiskor for basically single-handedly taking out just about all of the rest of the ads. Not all of them. I'm trying to remember the other guy who took out several... Was it Aragona? I actually can't remember. Forgive me. But Rory and Whiskor both were just charging and stabbing and charging and stabbing and charging and stabbing and charging and stabbing and charging and stabbing. And one of my favorite incidents was there was a centaur standing at the edge of the ravine, and he, Whiskor did a bull rush charge type attack and hit the centaur so hard he actually went through it and then tumbled out on the other side into the ravine. And I'm sorry, that's rather gory, admittedly, but the whole situation was just rather comical at the time, and they're like, God dang, Whiskor, and then of course now he smells absolutely terrible. And he barely managed to avoid tumbling into the ravine. Actually, there were several incidents of people who were just like, okay, trying not to tumble into the ravine. So Zeiss, their only rogue, decides he's going to go ahead and disable the traps, now that they've got time to do so without, you know, people shooting at him, on the stairway. It takes them a little bit of time. They manage to get down, and they find the facility, the sanctuary, in just complete disarray, right? So, the reason for this, I didn't really mention this, but during the Enrage, one of the new attacks that the Centaur Lord was going to be using was this Earthquake stomping ability that hit within a certain range and could do pretty significant damage, all things considered. Now, if you're paying attention, you remember that this facility, the sanctuary that they built out, this hovel, domicile is really the word I want to use, is underground, only about 80 feet down, directly from where they were doing these earthquake attacks. So quite a few chunks of it had caved in, ceilings were still unstable, blah, 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 blah. So the party immediately, by the way, the party is still barely alive, but the party is like rushing around trying to help, you know, hold up chunks of rock and whatnot, and save the various people that they basically just unintentionally jeopardized their lives in. However, as they discuss things with Slavina, which is the leader of the Dragon Flayer, they realized, or at least theorized, that it is entirely possible that perhaps it was not actually them that was the target, but rather maybe the centaurs had been here to take out the kobolds and the Wildpaw. Now, sorry, I'm looking over my notes trying to remember a couple of names here. So they go ahead and end up being like, yay, we saved the peoples, and they also learn one other interesting fact. The life elemental that had been there, which I do not remember the name of. The way elementals work in this setting, they have a certain amount of substance. That substance can be renewed by something like their element, in the case of a life elemental being near the celebration and joyousness of life will help renew that energy. But they also can expend that energy and kind of have to in order to do basically anything. The elemental and the kobolds had lived in symbiosis for forever, giving and taking this energy. But during this emergency, the life elemental basically spent itself into dissipation. I don't have a better word, it dissipated, it stopped to exist, because it spent itself to death to save all of the kobolds who were there, or at least try. So the kobolds and the Wildpaw and the gnolls are both in a very bad way at this point, and the party's like, okay, this is now our problem. We need to deal with this, because several members of the party do have a sense of honor, dignity, goodness, etc. Some don't. Some disagreed with this whole process, and that's fine. The party heads back to town to try and figure out what they can do about this, and they all agree one of the first things they need to do is confront Harkin. Now, I kind of skipped over this earlier, but one of the things they got from the gnolls is a contract. This contract was something that the gnolls had signed with Harkin, who was the guardian, by the way, if you've already forgotten the name. He had basically he had been offered the ability to. The gnolls had been offered the ability to settle nearby, and Harkin would use his influence and charisma in order to make this happen in exchange for them doing the artificial attacks. Now, obviously, I already mentioned this before. I'm just re-mentioning this to get across the point that they actually found proof, a contract, right? Gnawbone. I'm sorry. This whole time I've been trying to think of the name of the gnoll leader, Gnawbone. So they get the contract from him, and they go back. On the way back, I'm going to mention this very specifically, and I'm not really going to explain it. On the way back, they encounter a individual who they recognize as one of Harkin's fellow people, troops, adventurers, loyal soldiers, whatever you want to call it. And I told the group, I want you to be very specific about how you approach him. It really is relevant. They decided to go ahead and wave, just be like, hey, what's up? And not try to attack him or anything like that. They took quite a while deciding this, and I said, it's okay, you can take your time. They decided to go ahead and just be like, hey, what's up? And he's like, oh my god, are you okay? Because they still have several people who are unconscious or injured. And they're like, yeah, we just had a bit of a scuffle. And he's like, oh my god. And he directs them towards the local healer. Like I said, I'm not going to explain that. You can deduce from that what you'd like. So they run into town, and they decide to do things in a very particular order. You'll forgive me for not remembering the exact order off the top of my head, but one of the first things they did was they went to the Adventurers Guild with the proof in order to prove that the bill was in bad faith. That's what happens when the term should be obvious, all things considered. Hang on just a second. There. So, a bill in bad faith means, okay, the way the bills work, in brief, you pay for the bill in advance. The guild actually holds on to the gold for the payment, and once the bill has been completed to satisfaction, that is the point at which the gold is released to the adventurers, right? A bill in bad faith, if you can prove it, and, you do have to prove it, means that that gold is still yours as the adventurers because it was a defunct bill. It shouldn't have existed like that. And that person, and there's other political and possibly, you know, repercussive consequences of that as well, but you get the point. So they go back to him, prove the bill is in bad faith, and are like, okay, sure. They also check out the local constable and find out that the local constable is basically kind of useless. He is old, he is bitter, and he just really can't bring it in himself to care. So, after extensive bothering him about the whole situation, they finally say, okay, look, fine. Can you help us out at all? And he gives them a completely raw recruit to work with them. So, the recruit goes with them, and they chill at the bar for a while. They chill at the tavern, while several of the members, of course, go to the healers and try to get healed, including Coulson, I believe. One of the party members, I believe it was Zeiss, goes out to do a gather information check, and as he's roaming around, he finds out that Harkin left town. Now, the timing of this is hilarious. Because they didn't go to Harkin first, Harkin got wind of them showing up. This is all obvious, which is why I don't mind telling you this, and decided to split for whatever reason. So, he ran. Zeiss finally gets back and informs them, somewhat casually, that Harkin is fleeing, and they're like, oh god, and they go right after him. Now, overall, they estimate that it's been about 3 hours since he left, so he has a huge lead. They go ahead, get the wagon, get the horses, and send the people who can move faster, mostly the lycanthropes, up ahead. Now, the lycanthropes do very well on their rolls for basically smelling something on the air. And they're like, oh, that's odd, and it's off the trail a bit from where they're going, because they were following the direction he was rumored to be fleeing in. They follow it for some time and discover that there's a mound of sand from which the smell is coming, and they're like, well, that's odd. They start to unearth the sand, and they find several corpses, 8 of them, in fact. Harkin is one of them. Now, when I say corpses, this is actually kind of important. These people are desiccated more than they should be after 3 hours of decay. That's several people pointed that out, and I was like, yep, that was deliberate. They are decayed as though they've been decaying for an hour. It is entirely likely that, given another day, there would be no corpse left at all. In fact, ironically, the thing they were smelling was not the rot, but actually a very unusual and bitter poison or caustic substance of some kind, which was on the corpses themselves, which they theorize was what was causing the rapid desiccation, rapid rotting of the corpses. Disintegration would actually probably be a better word, to be completely honest with you. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't remember the exact order of events of what is about to happen. Several party members... Okay. Some of the party members either go back to town or were left back in town. I'm sorry, I don't remember how it happened, but I remember that Zeiss and Ariguna ended up heading to Harkin's house to investigate. They didn't find anything incriminating or interesting. However, they did find some gold and a fridge. When I say fridge, it's actually a small box, something you could carry in your hands, which is being powered by a certain form of water-charged elemental magicite, which can keep the food within preserved. You know, a fridge. And so Ariguna takes the fridge and the food in it, including an egg, and yes, I mentioned that egg very much on purpose. And Zeiss tries to take some of the gold without Ariguna catching it. Ariguna, of course, being the most horrible human the most horrible mite in the universe, is like, wait a minute, you need to give me some of that money too, and so then they split the money. Rory, I believe, immediately starts stripping the corpses and of Harkin and his guard. Now, this is really important. These people had a very, very small amount of magical residue on their backs. They also didn't have anything stolen from them at all. Their equipment was all still there, their weapons were still holstered, and their gold was still there. Just like that, right? So they're stripped bare, of course. And at about this time, Caladrius heads back to town and basically starts telling everyone, oh my god, we found Harkin. And he's alive, and we gotta help him. I believe the general idea was to try and ferret out someone who was in on this, so to speak, to try and get a reaction from someone. You know, wait a minute, he shouldn't be alive, he should be dead. However, one of the things that was failed to be taken into account is the fact that Harkin is a local hero. As I mentioned before, he is incredibly charismatic. And yes, I know, charismatic orc, just leave it be. He was very charismatic, he was very sociable, he was very well liked by the people, and so he was something of a local hero. So as soon as he mentions this out to the town proper, let's just say by the time he turned around and was heading back towards the actual site, with a healer in tow, I might add, he had a crowd of several hundred people who were worried about what happened to their fallen hero. So, do try to picture this. There is this mob of people who are like, oh my god, something's happened to Harkin. While the rest of the party, with 2 exceptions, is sitting at Harkin looting his corpses. You know, his corpse and the corpse of his men. So they're like, oh my god, wait a minute. I decided to go ahead and give them basically a bone and say, okay, you have you intuit that you need to get the hell out of here, basically. I think I mentioned that they actually did hear the crowd coming, because they weren't exactly trying to be subtle. And so they had a very brief period of time to basically shove all the gear onto the cart and run. So the mob encounters it and is like, oh my god, they've been looted and everything. Oh my god, they've already been killed. And Caladris is like, oh, that's terrible. What do we do? And the healer's like, we need to bring them back. And this whole time Caladris is like constantly looking amongst the crowd, examining the healer, trying to see if he's lying. He finds absolutely nothing, as you might imagine, actually. It's just a bunch of people who are terribly terrified about the fact that their heroes have just been killed horribly and then looted and left in the sand. So they bring them back, and there's this like funeral pyre thing they go through. And a day passes, and the actual head of the no, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. There was a very brief period of time in which the city, I really should put that properly, was put on lockdown. And that was because of a great deal of paranoia, because the strongest theory about what happened to Harkin was that the show had killed him, that this was a prelude to an attack, that Harkin had discovered some show troops or something like that, and the show had killed him. So the entire city was put on complete lockdown. Now, the party themselves were actually under some degree of suspicion for being involved with the whole situation, especially since they have a Burun and a Sclavi amongst them. However, that was actually cleared up relatively quickly. I didn't even make that an issue for them, nor do I think it should have been. I just mentioned it. Ugh. Oh my, hang on. Gotta stretch my back a little bit here. Okay. So, they collect the gold from the guild bill, and they take all the loot from Harkin and his people. And they go and like, okay, we've only got 1 lead left on this whole thing, and they go to talk. Talk with the mayor, and the mayor is dealing with Hotawa. The mayor's name was Zigand. I don't even know why I remember that. He was a banderling, and Hotawa was also a banderling. I mentioned him earlier. He was the gentleman who was very popular, a merchant, very wealthy in the date and fig trade, but very much a people person. The governor of the entire state of Al-Jalima is here personally. Toltarn is his name, and he's very much a politician. He knows how to work the people. But as he's starting to do his shtick, Zigand comes up and basically retires on the spot. He says, I resign my post. I willingly accept the end of my term here. And nobody was expecting that at all. So Hotawa is very quickly voted in as the new mayor, but no surprise there. And he has a huge crowd of people investigating him. The party decides to go ahead and quote-unquote confront him. They reveal quite a bit of information to him in confronting him, which has its own repercussions, which the party never actually found out about, so I'm not going to tell you about it, but let's just say it had its repercussions and leave it at that. They confront him and say, here's what's going on. However, what they do end up securing is his agreement to work above board, so to speak, with the Dragonflayer kobolds and with the Wildpaw gnolls in order to give them basically what amounts to local settling rights, as long as they're willing to chip in with the local militia. So that's settled. Okay, we've gotten that figured out. And they go back and give them the good news. Yay! One of the other things they do is they go and they talk with the mayor, the former mayor, I should say, Zigand, and they find out... Actually, did they ever find that out? No, they didn't. I'm sorry. I'm speaking out of turn. I gave several. I told the players that because this is a tutorial and because I wanted the whole point was to get them used to my GMing style, I would give them out of character knowledge of what was really going on and what could have happened and what might have happened. I will not be telling you that because that's not really part of the story, at least not from your perspective. So apologies. That's actually basically it. That was basically the end of the first adventure. Now a couple things happened in short order thereafter. First of all, a couple of the party members left. Mostly because the real-life players left. That's fine, that's D&D, that always happens. One of the party members who left was Raver, played by Ivan, who you may recognize as the awesome guy who does the artwork and whatnot for, you know, the Mass Effect 3 ending, alternate, the Primes, Prelude, stuff like that. Awesome cool. Awesome dude. He had to leave for various RL purposes, and so what happened in character is Raver explains his backstory and plot, basically. He wants to free the lycanthropes. Now, everybody else basically thinks, in character, basically thinks he's crazy, because the lycanthropes don't need to be freed. There's nothing to be freed from, right? And it's also worth noting one of the other party members is a lycanthrope who is very much, you know, loyal to his house, House Vesmora, I do believe. By the way, Raver is not of a house. He was something of an experiment to create a lycanthrope who had the ability to breed. I'll get into that more later. But moving along. So Raver leaves on his own because nobody's willing to join him in his mad quest, basically. Relin, who is a gnome, ended up leaving. I had some plans for him to come back into interaction with the party in the future, but the party ended up going a completely different direction than I expected, so they never actually encountered him again. Whiskor, who was played by the third, probably my favorite player, all things considered. Sorry, guys. I worry that back at the time it came across as me pushing him, but basically I asked him, you know, do you want to, / will you, / would you like to, play another character, because the party was desperately lacking in direction. And A, Whiskor was a type of character who really didn't mesh with the overall general attitude of the rest of the party, and B, well, we needed a leader, basically, so I asked him, you know, would you be willing to try it and go for something like that? He ended up making this awesome character called Snarg. Now, again, I'm only going to describe this in brief because I intend to do a character section video soon, but Snarg is a gnoll of Wildpaw, one of the tribe of Wildpaw with Gnawbone's group. Gnawbone basically told Snarg to join the party and keep an eye out for Wildpaw interests, you know. I'll explain all that later. So Snarg ends up joining the group. There's also one other character who ends up joining the group fresh, my sister, playing Kezrinthka of Worker. She plays an Olthoi, and I was like, yes, finally, someone plays an Olthoi. Because I'm really pleased with the Olthoi race overall, and like, nobody ever wanted to play an Olthoi, and I was like, ah. Even when I was doing the live campaign, nobody wanted to play an Olthoi, but someone finally plays an Olthoi. Lol. Well, let's just leave that be. So, anyways, she, is a fellow adventurer, quote-unquote. She's been with the Adventure Guild for some time now, a couple months, I believe. Had a whole thing about it, and found out about this bill, and she really, really wanted the opportunity to study humans, because she'd only barely heard about them, like, a few weeks prior, and there were 2 humans in the party, and she really wanted the ability to see how different races interact with one another in unusual circumstances. And that's basically why she joined the party. I'll talk about her more later. Again, character section. So with those changes up, they decide, okay, what do we do? Well, they go to the guild and find out... Whoa, sorry, don't mean to hit the mic there. They find that there are 2 additional bills in the guild now, a couple of which have been there basically for some time, for all intents and purposes. One is for Kheynth, which is to the east, and one is for Al-Farin, to the south. The Al-Farin one is posted on behalf of the Order of Summoners, and basically they're having trouble with a rogue golem, and they need to go deal with this golem, so that's basically all the information there is about that. I'll talk about golems a bit more when it becomes more relevant. The one to the east is that they're having some kind of issues or difficulties regarding being able to function, basically. And there's actually very few details, but overall they just learned that they're doing not so well in Kheynth. Now the group, again, is like, okay, let's vote for this, and they all vote, and Kheynth ends up winning just barely. So, okay, well, I'll go to Kheynth. On the way there, they encounter... Well, okay, no, they don't encounter, actually. They find out that there is a large pack of armadillos who have settled on the area. Now, armadillos are extremely territorial and roam throughout the desert extensively. By the way, this whole area is very much Sahara Desert style. It's not the whole area. There are obviously breaks in the sands, but this is the location of what is called the Reach, which is a vast desert, you know, which covers most of the section. Anyways, so they decide to, you know, okay, we can push through these guys, or we can try and go around. And going around is going to be quite a bit of a detour, because the armadillos, thanks to Snarg's information, because he's well versed in creatures, can claim upwards of several miles in any direction of land as their own. They won't attack you unless you actually impose on their land, and they know the exact foot at which, you know, their land begins and ends. So the party goes all the way around, ends up in Kheynth, heading towards Kheynth. Now, something very important happens as night has fallen. Night falls, and they're moving through the quiet, and I think like 2 party members succeed at their awareness rolls and look up and see something moving through the sky, and they point it out to everybody else. What they see are 3 battle-ready frigate-style airships. Now, I haven't discussed airships in terms of the rest of the world in great detail. But basically, the frigate class, basically, let's just call it that, even though it's not actually their class, whatever, you follow me. The frigate class is basically as big as it gets and as strong as it gets. Those are the warships, those are the big ones. And they have the ability to basically run silent. They won't generate any noise, and they have all the lights off. Now, that is very dangerous to do, because they have to rely... They also have their magical sensors turned off, because those will just light up everything nearby like a frickin' sun flare, you know? So they have to be very careful in their maneuvering, and they have to be very, very, very slow and cautious in how they function. But if they do so, the airships are practically invisible, excuse me, especially given how dark it is and the fact that there was no moon this night in the sky. So they noticed these airships, and they're heading on a northwestern direction. Now, most of the party, some of the party members were just like, whatever, but most of the party was had what I would like to consider the appropriate response to that, which is dread. Anybody who's been paying attention to the setting overall knows that war has been inches from happening for some time, and to watch a large group of battleships sailing through the sky clandestinely probably didn't soothe any nerves. They finally get to Kheynth, and they start to investigate a little bit before they go to sleep. One of the first things they find out is that the water has something going through it that looks suspiciously like blood. If they touch the water or try to interact with the water, whatever touches it or interacts with it rots / ages / desiccates very, very, very quickly, and causes immense pain to do so. Whatever is wrong with the water has basically poisoned the ability for them to grow crops or anything. Also, it's killing their ability to drink, because that was their main source of drinking water. This river was an excellent source of fresh water for them for basically as long as this town existed. Now, unlike Al-Erat, which is where they just came from, Kheynth is a very small town, all things considered. Doesn't have most of the proper facilities, doesn't have adventuring posts, doesn't have any order or guild posts, anything like that. So they sleep the night, wake up the next morning, and they find that the mayor is literally already waiting for them, because, you know, a small town where it gets around. And he asks, you know, eagerly, please tell me, you know, are you here to help with our problem? And they're like, yes, what is the problem? And they're like, well, the problem is that the water is poisoned or something. We don't even know what's wrong with it. The local militia is busy for whatever reason, so the military hasn't been able... And when I say militia, I actually do mean military. Local military has been busy, so they haven't been able to check it out yet. We sent our local militia, which is 8 guys who have happen to have weapons, who are actually farmers. And they tracked, the source of the problem to a nearby cave, which the river runs through. But when they got nearby, there was this horrifying yell, and they decided to back off, which I think was the right decision, because, if there's some creature in there, they wouldn't be able to they wouldn't be able to deal with that. So we posted a bill, and we're hoping for the best. Now, they actually posted the bill some time ago. It's actually basically at the point now where if another week or so had passed by like this, they were going to have to evacuate the town. Possibly less than that. So the group says, okay, let's go ahead and check out this cave. The group heads north, runs along the side of the river, towards the cave, and naturally when they get close to it, there's this horrifying scream, and everyone has to do a will save. I mention this for the sake of almost amusement. Of the various people who succeed in their will save, one of the ones who does not is Rory, the human barbarian I mentioned earlier. And I let him roleplay this whole sequence where he basically psyched himself into managing to continue, because I told him, it's like, okay, you can wait here, or you can try and push forward somehow. If you can figure out a way to mentally convince yourself to do so. So he succeeded. Good posts, good posts. Now, the inside of the cave is actually kind of hard to describe. Once you get in, the river keeps going, and on the west bank of it, it's a north-south river, by the way. On the west bank is nothing of any real interest except for a land bridge that goes over it towards the east bank. On the east bank, there is a young elven woman who is continuously washing her hands in the river. And that is a source of the red trail that is going out. By the way, one additional thing, they analyzed the river before going up there with a scan spell and found out that it had the water affinity attached to it. Now that may sound kind of duh, but that's not actually how that works. Water elemental energy does not mean water, the physical stuff, right? So just clarifying there really quick. Now, Hegade, I believe, succeeded in his awareness check and actually saw something kind of glittering at the base of the river and pointed it out to everyone else. And I've kind of been skipping over this because I want to describe this as well as I can. Right next to the woman who is cleaning her hands continuously in the river, in the running waters, is this thing. It is this amalgamation of dirt and rock and viscous material and violet energy and this arcing lightning. It is just this horrifyingly looking abomination that doesn't quite even have a humanoid shape, and it's just sitting there. Several of the party members attempt to sneak around and through and otherwise, but I basically mention, as you're sneaking through, you get the very strong impression that you are being watched. Now, the observant party members also notice that on the other side, past the abomination creature thing and the woman, is some kind of staircase which looks incredibly artificial. Like, there is no way in hell that that was a natural formation. Somebody obviously built a staircase into this place. Rather large, all things considered. Like, say, 10 feet wide by 10 feet tall, something like that. Anyways. Now, of course, they try to talk to the woman, but this responds in absolutely nothing. She doesn't even react to their presence. Neither does the abomination until they get closer. Now, as they get closer, it turns, relatively speaking, to give them the impression that it is looking right at them. Now, they manage to sneak their way by until finally Guido gets a little bit too close, and immediately it lets out this horrifying wail, which actually knocks out the entire party with, like, 2 exceptions. Now, fortunately, it doesn't actually do anything else, because no one actually attacked it. But simply getting in close proximity screwed everything up. And once it let out the wail, it did this weird thing. Like I said, it's just kind of this amorphous mass, right? Part of its mass enveloped Guido and pushed him back like 5-10 feet up against the cave wall, and then withdrew, and then returned to the rest of the mass of the creature. Now, Guido actually was injured by this, but I mentioned to him, I was very open with him. It's like, this is not damage, this is lore damage, this is damage for a reason. I'm trying to get a point across. And what it was basically he felt like there was burns and scars all along his body all of a sudden. It was only 1 point of damage, but you get the general concept here, right? So several of the party members are like, okay, we're going to head downstairs, and several of the other party members are like, okay, we're going to stay here and try and figure out what the hell we're doing. The group splits up, because that's always the best idea in the world. I'm sorry. I shouldn't say anything. Now, I'm going to describe what happens to the group up top first, because it'll take less time. As they're doing their thing, just kind of talking and trying to figure out what's going on with the river, and trying to see if they can figure out a way to get the stone that is, like, affixed to the base of the thing. They do end up using this trick with, like, a rope and a staff and, like, a fisher's net. It was actually very clever. Definite props. To try and get it dislodged. It was actually affixed to the base of the river, which is why it wasn't moving, but they actually managed to dislodge it and pull it up and analyze it. And it's just this little stone, but the stone was actually specifically designed to give off a false elemental affinity. In other words, somebody had actually thought to place this thing here specifically to give off the water affinity to throw people off of it, for whatever reason. After re-examining the water, it was now giving off an extremely strong spatial affinity instead of water. At about this point in time, they hear some strange noises and look around like, oh, what's that? And they think they see someone sneaking around, but they don't actually catch him. It isn't until they see him leaving that they realize that he has, in fact, left. And it's like, oh my god. And it's this orc in these mage robes. Completely nondescript gray robes. Nothing, no symbols, no nothing. And it's just an orc. They go chasing after him and almost catch him, but finally he casts the spell Exit. Now, that is significant for those of you who don't know, because the spell Exit is a heavy yellow spell. In other words, this guy has to be a bare minimum of a level 8 yellow mage in order to accomplish that. Just thought I'd point that out. The party understood the significance of that as well. And they almost catch him, actually, but all they can determine is the fact that he used Exit. So they get back like, okay. About this point, no, so while all this was going down, the party that went down finds several traps as they're going down the staircase, and finds this strange orb. Now, all throughout the ceilings and the walls and the floor of the staircase down and the rooms beyond it are these veins of Pyrial. When I say veins, I don't mean like you would see in a mine. I mean like artificial, like almost like circuitry. There's just, you know, a pattern to them, and they're interwoven everywhere on every surface. And all of them seem to be connected to this orb, which is sitting on a pedestal in the middle of the next room. Now they try to remove the orb, and the backlash of the magical energy from doing so literally sends the people who try slamming into the wall, and they actually take damage from the severity of the impact. They think about where to go next, and they're like, okay, we have no idea where to go next. So, shrug, they finally decide, okay, let's try that door. So they go open that door, and what they see is a Tusker. Now, I know that doesn't have the impact on you that it should. So let me take a step back and explain that Tuskers are near mythical creatures that basically no one ever actually interacts with. The most common sightings of them are within the Direlands, which is basically a place that nobody goes to or comes from because it is so dangerous. Let's just say I'll explain how dangerous the Direlands are later when I actually start talking about my setting in another video. So Tuskers are something that everybody fears, to a severe degree. Tuskers are the kind of things that you would send a small platoon or company or bigger up against. They are large, they are fast, and they are very, very strong. Now this Tusker looks relatively small, all things considered, and has a very crimson fur, which may or may not mean something to several of my Asheron's Call fans, but whatever. They see this Tusker, and it barrels at them really, really fast, like I said. And I basically tell them, okay, you literally have the opportunity to make an action, not even a full round action. You don't even have a full 6 seconds. You have 3 seconds to do something. Snarg, to my internal amusement, grabs his water pouch and flings it at the floor for the Tusker. His thinking was that, given the circumstances with the water and the fact that nothing had a source of water nearby because of the poisoning of it, that maybe the Tusker also hasn't had water, and maybe it would react positively to that. Well, the Tusker stops dead, you know, perfect breaking almost, grabs the water thing, sniffs it for a moment, and then drinks the whole thing in like one gulp, and then says thank you in common. Now again, this probably doesn't have the impact it should, but the idea that Tuskers have the ability to communicate at all, let alone have any form of sentience or intelligence, is another one of those things that was a complete unknown to everybody, and so they're just like, What ensues is a conversation with this Tusker who they discover, oh, what was his name? I had to write it down. So I could because I was spelling it over and over and over and over again. Where did I write his name down? Well, while I look that up, they discover that he was overpowered by a group of mages who basically forced him to stay here with a large amount of treasure. The whole point was that any given individuals who would try to come by, any adventurers who would come by looking for the treasure, his job would be to knock one out while their trap dealt with the other one, and then keep the one that was knocked out kept here. Now he was this Tusker was very upset about this idea. Where the heck is his name? I'm gonna have to actually look up the post, aren't I? Damn it. I swore I wrote it down. Give me just a moment, I do apologize. He was very upset at being forced to do, what he called such disgusting work, and he hated it, but overall, he basically didn't know what else to do about it because, there it is, Olatunguska, that's his name. Olatunguska is the name of the Tusker. Now, I called him Olan, basically to simplify it, and several of the guys called him O, because they couldn't spell the whole name, but whatever. He basically was forced into the service and did the best he could to take care of the one adventurer who did fall into the trap. From him, they learned that two adventurers, probably a couple, an elf, male and female, showed up. The female was hit by this bizarre trap, and he took the male and, put him in one of the prisons and took care of him. And he's basically just been kind of hanging out ever since. They do a little bit of research and find out that Olatunguska has been here for some time, weeks, give or take. I believe it was 2 weeks total, and was probably going to be here for at least another 2 weeks before they had to resupply his rations and whatnot. Now, they head up, and they discover that whatever Mr. Mage had done earlier... Well, okay, no. First, and yes, this is the order of events. They head up because they discovered whatever Mr. Mage had done earlier had basically activated the Abomination creature thing, and it had started fighting back, and it started attacking them. What ensued was an interesting boss fight. I specifically designed this boss fight to be very brief and very quick, but it's also at this point in time that I want to mention something that I didn't mention earlier, and I probably should have. There was this elaborate rune carved into what looked like solid purial in this 270-degree circle. Not a full circle, but like almost a full more than a full hemisphere, actually. You get the point, right? And it had floated up and affixed itself to the head, quote-unquote, of the Abomination and was now glowing. Several of the party members attacked that, and meanwhile, several of the other party members realized one of the things they could do is go and get the husband of the woman who was... They figured out very quickly that the Abomination and the woman were tied. Anytime they attacked the Abomination, it injured her, and vice versa. So several of the party members had the thought, we kill her, we kill the Abomination. Now, when I say Abomination, by the way, I want to take a moment and pause and say that it was an abomination not just visually, but elementally, magically. This was something that several party members had trouble looking at. Hanuel, who is a fairy, and Javan both, when they look at this thing, were literally assaulted by its presence. This thing was just wrong. Now, so it did take some convincing for them to try to find a peaceful solution here, but they sent, as they're fighting this thing, several party members are attacking the rune with all of the arcane writings on it, and others are going off and freeing the gentleman. Now they destroy the rune, the guy walks up and takes her into his arms, and it manages to defuse the situation. The Abomination actually merges into her, and for the first time she starts to acknowledge what's going on. She had been muttering this entire time as she was cleansing her hands into the river over and over and over and over and over and over, basically indistinguishable from anything coherent. And finally she stops and she's like, "Oh my God, you're okay." Now, I'm going to fast forward just a little bit to explain the exposition of what happens next, because they then start interrogating the two, to very little effect, actually, because he doesn't know much and she doesn't know much. But the long and the short of it is, when they showed up here, they were looking for something called the Mirror Key. It was this legendary treasure that they'd heard about, that rumors about had spread and abounded. They made their way here, discovered the cave, and once they went in, there was this strange flashing energy that just lashed through everything. He didn't have any effect, but she was actually knocked unconscious by it. At about this point in time is when Olan came up and grabbed him and was like, okay, I need to take you back here now. She, according to what she tells the party, then had apparently seen a vision of where she had been confused and stumbled, and her sword had pierced her husband, killed him. And she was horrified at the thought of the fact that she had killed her husband, and so she was continuously washing her hands in the river to get his blood off of her hands. Obviously, it would never come off because it was never there, but... well, let's just say that what we're dealing with is something that warps reality a little bit, and we'll leave it at that, which is why there actually was blood and poison in the water. Consequently, the very next thing they do is analyze the water, and sure enough, the water is just water again. Which everyone's like, yay! The Abomination thing, nobody has really any idea of what that was. In fact, I don't believe to this day the party has any solid idea as to what that was. I'm sure there's many theories, but I don't think it's occurred to them for some time. They've had other concerns on their minds. The last thing they do is they go down to the room and they find out that Olan had actually been defending a treasure trove, which actually didn't contain something that is a mirror key. I'll describe that in a minute. They basically make a deal with him. We'll figure a way to get you free if you give us all that treasure. And he's like, okay, I don't give a damn about the treasure, go for it. Now, logically, they figure okay, the way this works is he is physically bound with him. There is a very powerful shield barrier that prevents him from leaving a perfect sphere, of which this cave happens to be within. Therefore, there was no ability for him to even punch his way out through the rock, if you understand what I'm saying. I mean, a Tusker would be more than strong enough to be able to literally punch or dig or fight his way through solid rock in order to get out. But he couldn't because that barrier was in the way. So they theorized that whatever is powering it has to be outside, someplace he couldn't reach, because otherwise he could tamper with it. So they go outside, and they do actually successfully find it. It takes significant energy and strength of the group in order to destroy it, and when they do, it lets off this very, very loud sound wave actually, which actually deafens several of the party members, even the ones who weren't actually 3 feet from the source of it. So several of the party members have to roleplay being deaf for several minutes after this, but they go back and basically convey the fact that Olan is free, and they're like, yay! He helps them carry several of the treasures back to town. It's actually quite a great deal of treasure. It's a large amount of gold, several magical items, and a bunch of gems. In fact, it is 8 gems. I'm sorry, it is 8 each of 8 types of gems. I mentioned that because at the time, not very many people seemed to put any significance on that. But yeah, there are specifically 8 gems of each of 8 types of gems. Anyways, so they start divvying up the spoils. Several of the party members actually give their entire share of the treasure to the town, which actually is really, really, really helpful to the town, because if you remember, they're at a spot now where if they start regrowing crops right now, that's not going to help them out because they're already running through their reserves. And they'll be okay for like a month, but after that, you understand. So, or maybe not a month, I don't remember. I actually figured out the times at the time, forgive me for not remembering them right now, but the point is, by giving them this money, they can go and literally purchase food and water and be okay until the next harvest comes in. So the town is immensely grateful. They have this, everyone is just running through the streets. They're happy, they're joyful. Kids are dancing in the water and laughing because they can actually drink and swim and all that fun stuff again. One of the kids actually finds half of the piece of the rune. And it literally just occurred to me that I don't remember if he still has that or not. I'm going to have to ask the party members about that. But anyways, Snarg goes ahead and procures the piece of the rune. It's only half of well, it's actually more like a third of the overall device, but he does grab it. And, excuse me, they celebrate a night's good night's done. Excuse me for the yawn. Now I'm going to pause here. Well, actually, no, I'm going to go ahead a little bit further, because the next thing that happens is the next morning they agree to go ahead and escort a caravan, basically, of members from Kheynth to go to Al-Erat, and, they're going to be there. They're going to purchase food and goods and whatnot. they have basically an uneventful journey back. It takes a couple of days due to bad weather. And once they get back, they're like, okay, any news? The very first thing that I mentioned to them is that there's no news about anything to do with airships or the war starting. That actually, perhaps ironically, that actually makes everyone more nervous, not less. But then again, that was kind of the intent. So they decide, okay, well now what? And they discover that there's an additional bill plus the existing bill for the golem. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause here for the time being, and we will continue the adventures of the online group shortly.